On the 27th of July 2024, The Guardian published an article titled, "What is Nature? Dictionaries urged to include humans in definition." In it, the author Damien Gale introduces luxury interior decorator and businesswoman Frida Gormley, and environmental lawyer Jesse Mond-Wed, the founders of the We Are Nature campaign. We Are Nature argue that the current consensus definition of nature used by UK dictionaries is wrong, since it does not include humans. Indeed, nature is often framed as the opposition to humans. Quote, "the phenomena of the physical world collectively, especially plants, animals, and other features and products of the earth itself, as opposed to humans or human creations." End quote. They believe that this commonly held definition represents a false hegemony, since it denies the growing body of scientific evidence that humans are part of nature and wider ecosystems. In turn, these false definitions give us a false belief that we are distinct from and superior to nature, which in turn perpetuates the environmental crisis. We Are Nature essentially lobby dictionaries to change their definition of nature to include humans, ignoring the important role that dictionaries play in documenting how words are actually being used, as opposed to dictating how words should be used. This sets a dangerous precedent, wherein political groups can control language to suit their ambitions. We Are Nature claim that their definition of nature reflects both cultural and scientific consensus. However, their definition was, in fact, crowdsourced from a select pool of intelligentsia, academics, writers, activists, environmentalists, lawyers, and some school children, and is in no way actually representative of a genuine cultural consensus. Nor does it reflect any scientific consensus, for the simple reason that there is no consensus definition of nature amongst ecologists, due to the perceived lack of clarity around the term. As a result, the use of nature as a serious scientific concept has been all but abandoned by the environmental science community. Such an all-encompassing definition of nature might seem baffling. However, it does help us to understand how two professionals from the world of luxury interior design and law, in a marriage of the most laughably cosmopolitan sectors imaginable, could possibly come to the conclusion that they were appropriately positioned to speak on behalf of nature. The plugging of Frida Gormley's House of Hackney luxury design brand within We Are Nature's promotional material makes me question the extent to which this activism represents a serious campaign versus a cynical advertising push. Take this example from the very top of We Are Nature's About Us webpage. Quote, "House of Hackney is the B Corp brand inspiring people to protect our common home by bringing the beauty of nature into theirs." End quote. The idea that 200-pound rolls of recycled floral wallpaper are going to save the environment must be quite a hard sell to the increasingly environmentally conscious bourgeois clientele that House of Hackney caters for. Their involvement in an environmental activism campaign might be enough to justify their virtuous ethos, which would otherwise sound quite vacuous given the indulgent nature of their products. Ironically, We Are Nature's all-encompassing definition of nature includes those very mechanisms which have accelerated and magnified the pace of climate change and environmental degradation, like fossil fuel technology and modern agriculture, as these are all parts of humankind and thus nature. Therefore, this change in definition could have the exact opposite effect of the one desired, being used as a greenwashing tool to justify the so-called naturalness of techno-industrial complexes, in an embarrassing facilitation of the natural fallacy by the environmentalists to the benefit of the polluters. Furthermore, the organization advances a theory for the origins of the supposedly false nature-human dichotomy that is itself entirely spurious. They claim, with support from Professor of Ecology Tom Oliver, that the human nature split is derived from 17th and 18th century Enlightenment thinkers like René Descartes, who, according to Professor Oliver, quote, put forward the view that the mind is divine and godlike, and our bodies, and the bodies of other creatures, are just kind of lifeless matter, end quote. These figures believed that we should move away from states of nature, where life was considered to be, as Thomas Hobbes put it, quote, nasty, brutish, and short, end quote. Now, of course, it is the case that these were indeed the views of many Enlightenment thinkers. However, it is a convenient coincidence that of all the Enlightenment figures Professor Oliver cites, he fails to mention Jean-Jacques Rousseau, one of the most influential thinkers of his time, who believed that humans should return to nature to escape the corrupting influence of civilization, contradicting the neat framing of Enlightenment thinkers by the professor. Clearly, the milieu of the Enlightenment was, at the least, just as conducive to ideas of reconnecting with nature as they were with splitting from nature, despite what We Are Nature and Professor Oliver have to say about it. Furthermore, it is wrong to assume that the Enlightenment represents the beginning of the nature-human dichotomy in Western culture. The Bible, which contains stories that date back to the 10th century BCE and further, is filled with references to the dualistic relationship between humans and nature, reflecting a much deeper conceptual history than We Are Nature and Professor Oliver would like to admit. Be it for the purposes of dominion or stewardship, Genesis clearly states a belief that we humans were made in the image of God, so that we could stand out from nature and rule over it. The Israelites flee from the tyranny of Egyptian civilization by embracing the hardship and terrors of the wilderness, leading them to dream of the land flowing with milk and honey, symbolizing the necessity to create their own perfected society from out of the poverty of nature. Jesus Christ himself becomes a microcosm of this dualistic relationship when he removes himself from society to engage in a struggle with the wilderness, an environment which simultaneously expresses and magnifies the spiritual struggle that he engages in internally. Only after he confronts Satan does he then feel worthy enough to return to the ordered life amongst his followers in civilization. Indeed, the dichotomy can be traced back even further to the pre-Judeo-Christian world of the pagans. The Greek titan Prometheus defies the gods who preside over nature to gift fire, the primordial tool, to humanity, so that they may create a more civilized world. While in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which dates back to 2100 BC, the ancient Mesopotamians contrast Gilgamesh, the king who maintains the boundary between society and nature from within his walled city, with Enkidu, a being of nature who lives alongside animals beyond the defined limits of civilization. I would argue that the dualism even extends beyond the Western tradition and is in fact a universal motif independent of culture and economy. It can be found in the Chinese traditions of Confucianism and Feng Shui, in Hindu culture, and perhaps most surprisingly, even amongst tribal indigenous societies. These indigenous cultures, who we so often treat as being one with nature, use myth and ritual to express an implicit and sometimes explicit tension between the desire to live in harmony with nature and the desire to be different from nature, contrary to our popular, romanticized beliefs. Many indigenous cultures believe that humans have a distinct role to play in maintaining harmony between the spirits out in nature and the physical realm, while the common cultural practice of designating certain natural sites like rivers, mountains, and forests as sacred often entails a kind of separation between nature and humans, which humans can sometimes overcome through ritual. In ignoring the deep history and universality of the human-nature dichotomy, We Are Nature and Professor Oliver are able to rig a straw man origin story for the commonly accepted definition of nature. In their account, the idea of nature being separate to humans is a mere perversion of the truth by the inflated egos and ascended intellects of a handful of Enlightenment philosophers detached from reality. These thinkers who set the stage for so much of our modern materialist society believed themselves to be divinely rational, an obvious absurdity which taints the dualism idea by association, leading Professor Oliver to conclude that they and their ideas were, quote, slightly insane in the sense that it reflects a kind of insanity in our modern society, or a delusion perhaps, end quote. It is, in short, a dog whistle for the romantics out there who see in rationality the Luciferian intellect of John Milton's Satan, a motif which may make for sublime poetry, but certainly does not make for a balanced and sober review of the historical evidence. In reality, the idea is as old as culture itself, and has existed in nuanced tandem with the belief that we are, in some respects, part of nature, revealing a duality of conceptual models in how we relate to nature. Far from being the result of the abstract machinations of a detached group of philosophers, the dualistic idea of nature is actually embodied in the myths and stories which reflect our ancestors as a common people, ideas that were generated from the ground up around the campfires and dinner halls, and not from the top down of lofty academia. These ancient stories fail to fit into the sanitized political narrative that We Are Nature and Professor Oliver espouse, since almost all of them involve the innate hostility of nature and express the intuitive desire to separate ourselves from nature in order to survive and thrive. Even the great poet Dante would sooner descend into the bowels of hell, where there is at least a chance at redemption, than remain lost in the wild woods. The myths of the old reveal the fly in the ointment of the snake oil salesman, that we humans have long desired to escape from the deterministic shackles of nature, from hunger, thirst, disease, and predation, and create for ourselves a safer and more harmonious world through those distinctly human qualities, art and craft. No other aspect of nature can write, calculate, or consciously design in the way we humans can, and it has led to immense transformations of our environments and bodies. For all the remarkable nests that animals might build, they are mere piles of mulch compared to our great cities. We have achieved these cultural feats at a pace and scale that is utterly incomparable to anything else that has happened in the history of life on Earth, becoming a planetary force that exceeds even the great geological processes in terms of our rapacious ability to transform the land, sea, and sky. It is for this reason that we are distinct from nature, because we emerged from out of nature and learned to look back into nature, and became more than nature as a result. How could it possibly be the case otherwise? If we were truly indistinguishable from the rest of nature, we would be completely unconscious of the fact, since we would be little more than a writhing body of instincts and emotions. So much of what makes us human is the lived experience of this conflicting duality that exists within ourselves. We are the species cast out from the garden, simultaneously cursed and blessed to stand outside of unconscious nature through our knowledge of good and evil, while the memory of our roots within nature lingers on through our embodied instincts and unconscious impulses, our human nature. This is the beautiful and haunting nostalgia of the Romantics, the subconscious dream world of the psychotherapists, and the feeling of transcendental wholeness revered by so many faiths, which bring so much vitality and beauty to life. But it is also the root of so many of our murkier qualities, our aggression, paranoia, and ignorance, which leads to so much violence and political polarization. It is the defining feature of the human condition that we should be pulled between these two great forces, caught between Prometheus and the Leviathan, in a constant struggle to cultivate a new garden for ourselves, both within our souls and out in the world. Our approach is remarkable in that, unlike any other species, we can simultaneously apply tools forged by an intellect in opposition to the overwhelming odds of our evolutionary past, while also being able to see the benefits of a relinquishing approach, surrendering control to experience nature's majesty and medicine. It is a tragic poeticism that the environmentalists, in their coddling attempts to reconnect us to a benevolent Mother Earth, end up further alienating us from our own inner natures. As you can no doubt tell, my personal definition of nature is somewhat more nuanced than the one presented in the Oxford Dictionary, but that is beside the point, since I do not ever plan on changing the dictionary to suit my ends. Indeed, I do not believe that such infantilizing techniques of persuasion need to be applied, since I believe that a balanced definition of nature, which combines the tensions of lived experience with the deep wisdoms of our past, speaks for itself. Any other definition, which leans further into either our oneness with nature or our intellectual separation from nature, will inevitably lead to the obfuscation of the truth, which will either alienate us from the nourishing roots of nature or will blind us from the unceasing horrors of the wilderness. The nature-human dichotomy is part of the fundamental experience of life which forms the bedrock for our society, since it in turn provides the support for the great pillars of civilization, our sense of self and of community, since it defines the boundary not only between civilization and nature, but also between the part of the self that thinks and the part that spontaneously feels. When we on Nature lobby to change the definition of nature to suit a handful of creatives and academics, they do so at the expense of a basic clarity of mind found across cultures. Intellectuals must question the validity and permeability of these boundaries in order to establish the true nuance that exists within the human-nature dichotomy. But they must acknowledge the great risk that comes from such questioning, given the fundamental importance of the duality, and act with the utmost caution. If we forget the innate tensions that exist between us and nature, and naively accept that we are no different from nature, we risk losing sight in the importance of the boundaries that we have spent so long constructing. When we forget the value of the city's walls, we stop maintaining them, and we risk being swallowed up by weeds and vipers, like so many ruined civilizations before us. It is a physical manifestation writ large of what happens when we forget the distinctions and limitations that define us as individuals. Clear boundaries demarcate our autonomous sense of self from everything else in the world, giving us the confidence and clarity of thought needed to stand tall. When we lose sight of these boundaries, our orientation in the world is replaced by anxiety, as we no longer recognize our proper place amongst the near infinite range of possibilities and responsibilities that could be evoked on behalf of our completely interconnected relationship with nature, as expressed by the immense variety of forms and behaviors found in the natural world. Without boundaries, we become increasingly malleable, making us vulnerable to the forces of persuasion by the unscrupulous, which only hastens the pillaging of the spirit. As we become increasingly convinced that we are indistinguishable from everything else, our soul flattens out into depression, as everything special about us drains out from the crumbling crucible of our hearts and into the sodden streets. I fear that the so-called eco-anxiety epidemic of the younger generations is not so much due to environmental degradation itself as much as it is a result of this radical and blunt attempt by environmentalists to reshape the philosophical underpinnings of our relationship to nature, exposing them to levels of existential chaos that no young person should have to contend with until they have become resilient and fully formed adults. Even if We Are Nature's goal was achieved, and the definition of nature was changed to be inclusive of humans, there is no real robust basis to assume that this will lead to the desired effect of increasing sustainable behaviors. We need only look to a culture like Japan for proof that a personal and cultural identification with nature need not translate into sustainable policies. The two primary religions of Japan, Shinto and Buddhism, both emphasize the wholeness of being and a profound connection to the natural world. And yet the country is still marred by environmental woes, despite 80% of Japanese people engaging with these faiths. Japan ranks 5th in the world for greenhouse gas emissions, and of all the G7 countries, it is the one that has made the least progress in meeting its 2030 ambitions. It is the second highest producer of plastic packaging waste in the world, almost 2/3 of which it incinerates, releasing dangerous, persistent environmental pollutants into the atmosphere and food chain. Fish stocks have been in decline since the 1990s, and Japan remains one of only 3 countries that still practices commercial whaling, leading to international criticism. Indeed, Japan's one major environmental credential on the world stage, its remarkably high forest cover compared to other developed nations, with 67% of the country being covered in forest, is much more a product of geography and economics than any spiritual closeness to nature. The country has a mountainous topography which precludes agricultural development, and over 40% of the forests are man-made plantations, which have been grown since the 18th century to secure timber demand. Clearly then, having a perception of oneself as being a part of nature does not necessarily translate into sustainable behaviours. I say all of this not only to call attention to the deficiencies of the We Are Nature campaign, but to also highlight the failings of my own profession. Instead of engaging with the fascinating philosophy and history which make up our professional intellectual inheritance, we have instead abandoned them. We made this decision not because nature has become obsolete as a term, as we have merely substituted it with slightly more specific concepts like ecosystems and biodiversity, but because we are unwilling to engage with the humanities, even though humans now significantly influence ecosystem dynamics. As a result of our abandonment, we have created a vacuum that political radicals and unscrupulous business people from both sides of the aisle can exploit for their own ends. I believe that the responsibility on the part of me and my fellow environmental professionals to curate an honest discourse around our society's relationship to nature could not be greater than it is currently, given the importance of our intellectual contributions to the debate surrounding climate change and biodiversity loss and the fever-pitch atmosphere in which these debates increasingly take place in. Yet I see time and time again a pandering amongst my colleagues to the radical political perspectives that dominate the environmentalist milieu. These panderers are often in considerably more senior positions than I, and some of them, like Professor Oliver, are directly complicit in spreading misinformation for the sake of political aims. Shockingly, Professor Oliver publicly acknowledges a similar concern to my own, that there is a distinctly Orwellian tone in these attempts to manipulate our common language for political ends. Yet his overall critique of We Are Nature is weak, and he seems to accept rather half-heartedly that the ends justify the means, while the question of tyranny over language is left hanging uncomfortably in the air. In our inability to contend with history and our desire for political relevance, we ecologists have played our part in obfuscating the common sense experiences of life and have totally lost sight of the forest for the trees. Let it be known that this ecologist, at least, does not support the manipulation of language and the distortion of facts. I will continue to fight for the nuanced truth that we are rooted to nature while also being more than nature.